By the 1830s, European Romanticism had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and morphed into what became known as transcendentalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the chief philosopher of transcendentalism, and his essay Nature is considered kind of the first manifesto, if you will, of transcendentalism. So, what was Romanticism and transcendentalism? It's not the purpose of this lecture to cover all of that. That would take quite a while, but let me just hit the high points. So the Romantics in Europe were reacting in some ways against the age of reason and against industrialization. So as opposed to kind of elevating reason, the Romantics and the Transcendentalists after them believed that in our championing of reason, we had neglected something that they thought was just as important, if not more so, and that was the imagination, the human imagination. Also, again, like I said, a reaction against industrialization. The Romantics and the Transcendentalists after them really valued nature. They thought that nature had a spiritual significance. In fact, you'll see that the title of this essay of Emerson's is Nature. Romanticism and Transcendentalism also kind of idealized children. This was, it goes all the way back to the French philosopher Rousseau, who had this view that children, they liked children because in the Romantic view, children had not yet been corrupted by social conventions and traditions. Rousseau, and for the same reason, Romantics and Transcendentalists kind of idealized quote unquote primitive people groups as not having been corrupted by civilization. So let's, again, I'm tempted to go further, but I don't want to make this video 2 hours long. So, and we'll get into more of these ideas specifically as we go through the essay itself. Another thing about transcendentalism, we'll see this right off the bat at the beginning of Nature, is there's a real nonconformist streak. Another thing I forgot to mention, this was central, a valuing of individualism. But before I start quoting from the essay, let me give you a little bit of Emerson's background. Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister, and Emerson himself was a Unitarian minister until he broke from the church, because Unitarianism is already a very non-orthodox denomination. And Emerson pushed that boundary even more. Namely, especially in Emerson denied the deity of Christ. So he's like Thomas Jefferson in that regard. And Emerson believed in how does the editor of this book I'm drawing from, he believed in the general divinity of humanity. He was a humanist. The central tenet of humanism is that human nature is inherently good. Again, that's why Rousseau thought children are perfect before they're corrupted. So whenever humanists look at the different ills in the world, that they believe that those aren't the fault of humans themselves, of human nature, but all the bad comes from the artificial, what they see as artificial institutions, religion, and certain kinds of formal education, etc. Whereas, the flip side of that, I guess the more traditional view is that no, human nature is inherently flawed, not inherently good. We were created in God's image, but the fall came about, and so in human nature, that as humans we are inherently selfish and given to evil. So let's look at the first part of this essay, Nature. Emerson says, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy the original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" So Emerson then wants to break away from studying the Bible. He sees the Bible as just dead people's traditions. He wants us to have our own revelations, primarily through nature. So that's where he starts in this essay, and then from there the essay is basically Emerson is looking at the different levels at which we can appreciate nature, which nature provides for us. If you've ever read Abraham Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, Maslow's a psychologist who argued that, like for instance, until we gratify our base needs, like the need for food and water and shelter, when those needs aren't taken care of, we're not going to be thinking higher thoughts about, caring about other people and, spirituality and so on. This Emerson's model here is kind of like that. He says, at the base level, nature is useful in the sense of commodity, that we get our food and shelter, for instance, from nature. Then the next level is beauty, the aesthetic value of nature. The next level is language, that nature, we derive our language ultimately from nature through metaphor, all the way up to the spiritual component of nature. In fact, I guess you could say this is a little bit like some kind of Eastern religions and philosophies like Hinduism, Buddhism, where the goal is to transcend the physical. That's transcendentalism. So the label given to this American version of European Romanticism. So kind of a paradoxical focus on nature and the physical, but for the purposes of ultimately transcending nature to become kind of pure spirit. It's a little bit like, I just had this thought. It's kind of like, if you think about it, the Karl Marx's idea of the goal supposedly being to transcend class and government, to the supposedly the vision was to have a classless society where there would be no need for government. Everyone would just live in harmony. But to get there, ironically, evidently for Marx, required to get beyond government, we have to instill an even stronger, more all controlling government. So again, I'm not necessarily saying Emerson was a Marxist. I just kind of, as I was discussing contemporaneously here, that connection popped into my mind. Emerson saw that nature is a metaphor for the human mind, and that the natural symbolizes the spiritual. Now, Romanticism and transcendentalism, like I was really drawn to those when I was in my in high school and really even up into my early to mid 20s. And I think that's not by accident. I think that Romanticism and transcendentalism are appealing to the kind of adolescent impulse in all of us. But I still value some of the components of this philosophy, namely its insistence on individualism and not conforming to something just as a sheep, but thinking for yourself. And again, the next essay we're going to discuss is self-reliance, and I think that is a noble thought, to be independent, to rely, to not want to be dependent on like government, for instance. But as I got older and I would like to think a little more mature, I started to see the kind of darker side of Romanticism and transcendentalism. Started to see, I think, some of the blind spots of it. And basically, I guess I could summarize that by saying that, this insistence on individualism and when you push that to excess, which is, I think, what Emerson did, the individualism devolves into narcissism and solipsism, focusing so much on the self that you become blinded, kind of in your, to mix metaphors, in your own echo chamber. And it breeds a kind of arrogance to where you dismiss the wisdom of tradition and history and of other people. And so, really, if you want a more in-depth discussion of my qualms with transcendentalism, I've posted my essay, "The Jackdaw Blooms in Purgatory," on our modules. And if you open that document, and particularly if you read pages 17 through 28, there I refer to Emerson quite a bit, and a what I see as some of the dangers of this kind of philosophy. At the heart of that danger is what is called the Utilitarian Principle, and where Emerson approaches this principle is later in the essay. He says, "The great doctrine of use, capital U, namely that a thing is good only so far as it serves." So the utilitarian principle is to do whatever brings about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Now that sounds rational, sounds pretty good actually, until you peel back the surface layer, and you see that whatever brings about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, but even if that means sacrificing the individual or sacrificing some people for the good of the whole, the kind of classic way that this principle is expressed in utilitarian philosophy is, what if you can make a choice to bring about eternal bliss for all of mankind? But to do so, one person would have to suffer horrendous torture forever. Would you do that? Well, the utilitarians would say, yeah, of course, because it's a matter of numbers, right? Yeah, that one poor soul would have to suffer forever, but it would be worth it for the sake of billions of people living in bliss. I think there's a flaw, though, in that moral calculus. Namely, it reduces humans to numbers. But there are certain things that can't be quantified, and I think that the sanctity of human life is one of those. And I think that's one of the main ways that transcendentalism that's where it loses me. Um, um, that, it, and it's ironic because in its insistence on individualism, it ultimately betrays the individual for a more kind of communal vision of the supposed good of the whole. If you do read my, like I said, pages 17 through 28 in my essay, The Jackdaw Blooms in Purgatory, you'll see me reference Walker Percy in his novel, The Thanatos Syndrome, in which he makes the statement that abstract tenderness leads to the gas chamber. That being a lover of mankind in the abstract is a very dangerous place to be. In that novel, Percy points out that those who would become the Nazi death camp doctors were all, first of all, they were all the intellectual elite. They all had PhDs or medical degrees. They were, doctors, lawyers, psychiatrists, and they pride themselves on being very sensitive, compassionate people. Again, that's ironic, but beyond the irony, what Percy wants us to see is that's not just a coincidence. That there's that when once you start believing your own press, so to speak, you see yourself as being super compassionate on your own terms, as being kind of divine in your own efforts. That leads to a very dark place. It's like the biblical principle, pride comes before a fall. And the very people who think of themselves as being the most intelligent, the most compassionate throughout history, those have been the very people who have created the most evil, or not created the evil per se, but have committed the most heinous acts of mass genocide, like in the case of the Nazis, Stalin in Russia, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Mao in China. They were all theorists of mankind and saw themselves as doing what was good for good for the people in general, but they were willing to torture and murder actual individual human beings for, quote, the good of the whole. One passage I forgot to point out from maybe the most famous passage from this essay, Nature, is pretty early on in the essay. Emerson says, I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. So he says, I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. This is veering into that kind of dangerous abstraction that against which Percy warns. That Emerson is claiming he can somehow shed his own subjectivity and become this perfectly objective, transparent eyeball. That really, in a sense, he's saying he's pretending that he can become God and practice objective, judgment. That's a recipe for disaster in Percy's view and in my humble view as well. There's also a kind of another thing that ultimately turned me off of transcendentalism is there's a kind of real elitism about it, and it's really a bit of hypocrisy. And the transcendentalists, like the Romantics before them, claim to speak for the common man and to champion the cause of the downtrodden, but there's a hypocrisy I've noticed that throughout history, the people who claim to speak for the common man, in almost every case, they themselves are not the common man. They are the elite, who have never been the common man. They've never had to really work, for their living. Marx, the same way, he was not he was an elitist and claimed to speak for the working classes. Same thing with Emerson. You see some of this this elitism break through the surface in a couple of places. Let me show you. Here's the first one. Emerson says, this is a paragraph that begins with, "The world proceeds from the same spirit as the body of man." Well, towards the end of that paragraph, he says, "Yet this may show us what discord is between man and nature. For you cannot freely admire a noble landscape if laborers are digging in the field hard by." What he's saying is you can't really adequately appreciate nature if your beautiful picture is sullied by these low workers who are, how dare them make their living working out in the field and spoiling your view of nature that you have because you're elite, because you don't have to work for a living, so you can spend your time traipsing through the woods and just, sightseeing. So a very elitist, snobbish mindset. Another example, a few pages later, Emerson says, "At present, man applies to nature but half his force. He works on the world with his understanding alone. He lives in it and masters it by a penny wisdom. And he that works most in it is but a half man. And whilst his arms are strong and his digestion good," he has strong arms, he's a common laborer, "his mind is imbruted and he is a selfish savage." And a very elitist view. So on one, they speak out of both sides of their mouths. On one side, people, the philosophers like Rizzo and Emerson, romanticize and idealize the savage as the noble savage stereotype. But out the other side of their mouths, they say that this savage is a brute, is only half a man. So when I was in grad school, I started to notice this kind of this double speak, if you will, and I asked one of my professors about it. I said, "How is it that many of the people, because the postmodernist who would come after, same kind of thing, the postmodernist, again, in general, claim to champion the underdog, the common man against the rich and so forth. But I noticed that many of these same people, when you would catch them revealing from time to time their disdain for the average person. In our day, an example of that might be like what did Hillary Clinton use the term, a basket of deplorables, right? There's this elitist disdain for the common, average person, quote unquote. And so I asked my professor, what gives? How can, you on one hand claim to champion the common man, but on the other hand have this visible disdain for the common man? You know what she said? She quoted Walt Whitman, who we're going to read a bit later this week. Walt Whitman said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am great, I contain multitudes." Again, it's very, very Emersonian. He's this transparent eyeball who transcends our petty logic and things like, non-contradiction. I can contradict myself and be a hypocrite because that's all, I'm above all of that. To me, it's a cop-out. It's just a kind of intellectual game that falls apart ultimately. And so let me wrap it up with this, because this is related. I mentioned humanism earlier, and what I think is naive at best and destructive at worst. So because again, it's this the denial of the existence of evil is a sure way to succumb to evil. And so toward the end of the essay, just a couple of pages from where we were, let me start here actually, because this is another good example of what I see as the fatal error of transcendentalism. It's really it's an age-old problem. In fact, and what the book of Genesis describes as the original sin. The original sin was the human desire to become God. That's what the whole the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Really, the eating the apple, we've often kind of interpreted that as some kind of sexual connotation, but it really that misses the point. The Eve eating the apple and the Adam eating the apple. The real sin was trying to be on the same level as God. And so look, Emerson says, every spirit builds itself a house, and beyond its house a world, and beyond its world a heaven. I mean, Jesus says in the New Testament that he is preparing a house for his followers. But here, again, denying the deity of Christ, Emerson is saying, no, we build our own place in heaven. Know then that the world exists for you. For you is the phenomenon perfect. You can achieve perfection on your own, right? Again, he denies our sin nature. And he says the world exists for you. Again, the Bible teaches that no, the world exists for God, not for us, that God created us for his good pleasure. We were to serve him, not ourselves. That's the biblically orthodox view. But so from there, here's the last, in the middle of that paragraph, Emerson says, as fast as you conform your life to the pure idea in your mind, that will unfold its great proportions. A correspondent revolution in things will attend the influx of the Spirit. So fast will disagreeable appearances, swine, spiders, snakes, pests, madhouses, prisons, enemies vanish. They are temporary and shall be no more seen. Later he says, until evil is no more seen. So what he's suggesting here is that evil it doesn't even really have an objective existence, that we just perceive things to be evil. Now, on one level, I agree with part of that are spiders inherently evil, or do we just kind of project onto them? Yeah, I get what he's saying in that level, but I think he takes it beyond that to actually claiming that he denies the existence of evil. And anyway, he seems to think that we, just by sheer power of our human will, can eradicate evil. Again, that's biblically unorthodox, to say the least. The Bible teaches that we have the sin problem that we cannot eradicate on our own. That's the whole reason God had to appear in human form and had to become incarnate in human flesh, and that Jesus had to become man to get rid of evil for us, because we couldn't do it on our own. The Irish poet W.B. Yeats, even though he was a romantic in some ways, he didn't, to his credit, in my view, he did not. He ultimately recognized that no, evil does exist. It's not just a figment of our imagination. So Yeats says this, quote, Emerson and Walt Whitman are writers who have begun to seem superficial precisely because they lack the vision of evil. And I think Yeats would ultimately, or no, he does that. That's what he says about Emerson. And personally, I agree that there's a kind of superficiality. For all its seeming profundity, Emerson's philosophy becomes superficial in this sense that it denies reality. It denies the existence of evil. And here I quote, by the way, this is in that essay, the Jackdaw Blooms in Purgatory, the essay I've posted on the modules. This is page 24 of that essay. So I guess that's a good place to bring this lecture to a close. I hope that has given you some insight into Emerson and into this essay that you may not have had otherwise. I hope that's helped, and I will see you in the next lecture.